Hello YouTube, how is everyone doing? It's Professional here. So today I got the first part of my playthrough of Black Ops 1. So about a week and a half ago I asked you guys in a poll what game you wanted me to play next, and the overwhelming majority of people wanted me to play Black Ops 1. And we will be doing a cosplay playthrough for this series. I will be dressing up as the characters as I play through this, and so this is what Mason would be wearing during Operation 40. This is a Cuban shirt, Cuban-style shirt, and basically wearing straps with some ammo bandoliers down here. And also, one thing that will be very unique about this playthrough is that I will be talking a lot of Cold War history on this playthrough. So, if you really enjoyed the World at War playthrough, remember when I did the World at War playthrough and I talked a lot of World War II history, both the Pacific and the Eastern Front, I'll be doing the same with this playthrough, where I'll be talking a lot of the different Cold War history. I know history pretty well. I love reading history, and so I'll be talking about it, and probably I'll teach you something about the Cold War that maybe you might not have known. So I hope that you guys enjoy this playthrough. So we'll be doing the campaign here. Let's do it here. And I will be playing on... we're doing Operation 40 here. Operation 40. Undertake a daring assassination attempt during the Bay of Pigs invasion. We'll be doing on Hardened. I know some people want me to play on Veteran, but Veteran is not fun to do for a playthrough. It's not. It's annoying. Hardened is still a challenge. It's fun, but it's not like ridiculous like Veteran. So Hardened is always the playthroughs I do when I do Call of Duty campaigns.
Wake up. Wake up.
Where am I? Where's Reznov?
You will answer our questions. Do you understand?
Who the hell are you?
That's not important. What's important is who you are. What's your name?
Fuck you!
Where were you born?
Kiss my ass! Ah! Ah!
Your name is Alex Mason. You were born in Fairbanks, Alaska. In 1961, you served in a CIA assassination team known as Operation 40. Is that correct?
Ah!
Is that correct?
Yes.
Where's the broadcast station?
I don't know what you're talking about.
The numbers, Mason. What do they mean?
This
Where are they
line.
broadcast
I don't know
from?
anything about any numbers.
What about Dragovich? Do you remember him? Give us what we want, we'll guarantee your safety.
Ah!
Let's start at the beginning. Cuba, 1961, the Bay of Pigs. We know you were there.
This is the best Call of Duty campaign in my opinion.
No.
Do not fuck with me, Mason! I know when you're lying. 61, Bay of Pigs. What happened?
We all got killed.
There's no use lying, Mason. We know you went in with Woods and Bowman.
Woods. Bowman.
Dragovich. Do you remember Dragovich?
Castro. We went in to kill Castro.
The police are gonna be here soon. Let's make this quick.
Woods, it's been a while.
Well, enough, Carlos. You know Bowman, right?
Carlos.
This is Mason.
What's up, Carlos?
So you got what we need?
He will be in here. The plantation. My old plantation. Our attack on the airfield should distract them enough to get you inside.
What about the evac?
We will have transport waiting for you. Just be there.
Excellent. We got company.
Saquen los papeles. Ahora. Sal de aquí, puta capitalista.
Oye, ¿de dónde tú eres?
He said, where are you from?
Be cool,
Yeah.
Woods. Wait.
Talking to you.
I understood a bit of what he was saying in Spanish.
All right. Everything is ready.
Gear up, boys.
Say about the bar, Carlos.
No problem. My men will dispose of the bodies.
Occupants leaving their vehicles armed with shotguns.
Bowman, Carlos, lay down covering fire. We fight our way through the streets. Mason, on me. Let's go. He's dead!
Reloading, cover me!
Clear him out. Move up the street. Bowman, take the right.
On it.
Reloading, watch my six!
Target in the alley! Target down! He's down! Keep moving!
¡Necesitamos refuerzo!
Give me some cover! Okay, let's move!
This way, into the alley! Get to the car!
Oh, yep, here comes...
Shit, too many of them! Bowman, cover our six!
¡Están armados hasta los dientes!
I love this part.
Hit it, go!
¡Necesitamos refuerzo!
Get the fuck out of our way!
¡Necesitamos refuerzo! ¡Están armados hasta los dientes!
Roadblock!
See it!
Floor it, Mason!
He's fading away. Mason, you escaped from the police. The Bay of Pigs had begun. You were heading for Castro's compound. We're losing him. Do it again. We have no choice.
What the fuck?
There's a compound. Carlos and his men should be hitting the air.
Okay, so I didn't want to interrupt the intro too much there in the bar scene, but I did want to talk a bit about Cuba's history right here and talking about exactly what's going on. So the events of Black Ops 1 are obviously fictional, but these are all real events that's happening. Like Operation 40, this was a real life thing that happened, and the Bay of Pigs, this was a real life event that happened. So before I discuss what Operation 40 is exactly, I want to explain the situation in Cuba. I hope you guys don't get too bored by this. I love explaining the history in these games as I go through them. But anyways, Cuba has a very complicated history. Cuba was historically a colony of Spain. In the early 1900s, what happened was Cuba was going through a revolution. This is not the Cuban Revolution where communism happened. This is the revolution that happened in the, late end of the 1800s. So this happened in like the 1890s. Cuba was going through Cuba was having a revolution. They wanted to be an independent country. They did not want to be part of the Spanish Empire anymore. And what happened was the Spanish Empire was severely oppressing the Cubans. Now the US actually sent a warship into the harbors of Havana to calm things down, the USS Maine. Now the USS Maine exploded, killing a ton of American sailors on it. Now, to this day, nobody has definitive answers on why this, American battleship exploded. Some people think that the Spanish had done it, that they blew up the ship. That was the most common theory at the time. Other people think the Cuban revolutionaries did it to get the U.S. involved on their side. Other people think that there was a soldier that was smoking a cigarette near the artillery shells or somewhere in the explosive ordnance room, and basically the entire ship went up. So it was a giant explosion. The ship went up, blew up, killed a ton of American sailors. The U.S. then gets involved in the war against Spain. The U.S. declares war on Spain, blames Spain for the ship being destroyed. Spain denies it, and you have the Spanish-American War. This is actually happening at the exact same time of Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, what ends up happening is the U.S. wins the war against Spain. The U.S. acquires Guam, Wake Island, and Puerto Rico. That's how the U.S. has Puerto Rico to this day. The Philippines were basically made into a puppet state of the U.S. Cuba was kind of made into a puppet state, but had a little bit more freedom than the Philippines did. Now, what ended up happening is the U.S. had a treaty with Cuba that they could basically intervene if something was not going their way in Cuba. So if something bad was happening, the U.S. had the right to intervene in Cuba. Now, Cuba went through a series of presidential elections for some time, but then what ended up happening is fast forward a few decades, you had this guy, Fulgencio Batista, who was the dictator of Cuba. This guy was a military officer, and he had been a senator. He was a previous politician in Cuba's government. Now, about him, he was running in a presidential election in 1952, and he did not think that he could win that presidential election. So what he did was, because he was a military officer, he led the military in a coup against the Cuban government. He overthrew the Cuban government and basically declared himself president. And he was a dictator. And he was a really bad, evil dictator that ruled Cuba for the next 7 years. So there was a dictator in Cuba before Castro came to power, Fulgencio Batista. Now, Batista, a lot of people know him from Godfather 2. So Godfather 2 is a famous American movie. People know Batista from that movie. Now, what happens in the Godfather 2 when, Michael Corleone and the Italian-American mafia, they go into Cuba and they build these, giant casinos and hotels, that is actually based on real events. But what happened was, it was Lucky Luciano. So Lucky Luciano, he was a famous Italian-American mobster. He actually built casinos and hotels in Cuba with Fulgencio Batista. So Batista was a very corrupt man. He stole money constantly from the Cuban people. He worked with the mafias. He brought the organized crime into Cuba. They were building hotels and casinos. He nearly bankrupted Cuba. Cuban education was failing. I think it was like 30% of Cubans could not read or write. It was like really, really bad. There was massive corruption. And this basically breeds revolution. When you have a situation like this, you have an evil dictator that is just oppressing people, not allowing elections, working with the mafia, stealing money from the people. The people are living in absolute poverty. Education is terrible. This is basically breeding grounds for revolution. So Batista was a scumbag. He was a piece of shit, excuse my language. He was a terrible, leader, and he deserved to get overthrown. Now, the Cuban Revolution was justified. It was just justified to overthrow him, but I'm not defending the communists when I say this. I hate communists. I don't, support communism in any way, shape, or form. What I'm saying is that not every single person that fought in the Cuban Revolution was a communist. There's plenty of groups that actually fought in the Cuban Revolution that were not communists. So, literally, the vast majority of Cubans did not like Batista, which is why the Cuban Revolution went so well, is because he was such an unpopular leader. Everybody hated him. Virtually everybody hated him. Whether you were a communist, a capitalist, almost everybody hated Batista. Everybody could not stand his guts. They just absolutely despised him. So what happened is, during the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, who later became the communist dictator of Cuba, he led a movement called the 26th of July movement. The 26th of July movement, it was a left-wing movement, but it had some communist elements in it. But for the most part, it was not self-described as a communist organization, at least not at the start of the Cuban Revolution. And what people don't know is there was other factions that were also in the Cuban Revolution. There was a Second National Front of the Escambray. Now, this was another faction that was fighting against Batista. These guys were allied with the 26th of July movement, but they were not part of the 26th of July movement, so they were a completely separate rebel group from Castro's rebel group. They fought Batista for 2 years, and these guys, this rebel group, they were the first people to actually enter Havana. Not Castro during the revolution, not Castro's 26th of July movement. It was the Second National Front of Escambray. A lot of people don't know that, but this is what Castro and the communist government hides from the Cuban people. They act like Castro was the first guy in Havana when Batista was being overthrown. So basically what happens is, Castro ends up coming to power. The Second National Front of the Escambray, they unite with the 26th of July movement. Now, nobody really knew who Fidel Castro was at this time. Nobody knew his political ideologies. The only thing people knew about Castro is that he wanted to, overthrow Batista. Castro gave interviews where he said, "I'm not a communist. I support democracy in Cuba."
I want to know where your heart lies in the struggle between communism and democracy. Whose side? Where is your heart? And where is your feeling?
Really, saying that democracy. Democracy is my idea. Real. But many people used to call democracy seeing things that are not democracy. Democracy have some failings, not the idea. Those who use some of those who use democracy were. I am not communism. I am not agree with communism. My acts prove free press in Cuba. As you know, we have the full power in Cuba. Revolution. destroyed all the enemy army after a hard fight. And when we took the power, which were our systems? Free press to everybody, free ideas, free religion belief, and all those rights, those human rights that we could establish in the most abnormal,
Normal.
no, not normal, against the normal,
Abnormal.
in the irregular circumstance of the changing from one system to other. There is no doubt for me between democracy and communism.
Mr.
But not only democracy as a word. That is why we call our ideals humanism, because we not only want to give freedoms to the people, but to give the way of getting their life, to eat, to live. Not only theoretical.
Now, then at this point, what happened is when Castro became dictator of Cuba, he basically slowly became a dictator over time. He had the army behind him, and then once he had the army behind him, he started putting in several different laws, and nobody could really challenge him at this point. He became such a Castro was a very popular leader at the end of the Cuban Revolution. A lot of Cubans liked him. They thought that he was taking Cuba in a good direction. What Castro ended up starting to do is he started nationalizing businesses. He soon abolished private property, nationalized businesses, and this caught the attention of the U.S. at that point. The U.S. had actually cut off aid to Batista 1 year prior in 1958 because the oppressions that Batista was actually doing against the Cuban people. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that the U.S. made in their foreign policy when it comes to Cuba is the U.S. had supported Batista. The U.S. did support Batista. I wasn't able to find any proof that the U.S. had actually supported Batista's coup, so the U.S. was largely not involved in his coup, but once Batista actually came to power, they had largely supported him. Now, why did the U.S. support a brutal dictator in Cuba? The main reason for that is because he was an American ally. That was the primary reason. The U.S. had a really bad policy during the Cold War where the U.S. would support brutal dictators as long as they were pro-American. So as long as the dictators were pro-American, the U.S. government would support them. And that's what happened with Batista. The U.S. government largely supported him for a long time, and it was a mistake. The U.S. should not have done that. It was a terrible, terrible, bad mistake. Now, when Castro came to power, Castro, even though he claimed, I'm not a communist to support democracy in Cuba, he soon declared himself a communist. He said that Cuba was going to go through a socialist change, and what he did was he basically started attacking the U.S., not physically, but saying that the U.S. was supporting Batista, which was true to a degree, but what Castro was doing is he was using this to his propaganda in order to solidify his power, and then he was seeking aid from the Soviets, and the Soviets did not even know who Castro was at this time. Khrushchev was just completely surprised that a communist revolution had happened in Cuba. And a lot of people that had fought in the Cuban Revolution, they felt betrayed by Castro because they had fought a lot of good people had fought against Batista. They fought for a free and democratic Cuba, but Castro basically backstabbed all these people. He betrayed all these people. There was hundreds of revolutionaries that had fought on Castro's side, and Castro had them arrested and executed. A lot of these guys who had fought for Cuba's freedom, and Castro had declared them enemies of the people, enemies of the state. So these a lot of people, this is the thing is there are so many idiots out there. There's so many communists and so many idiots that defend defend Cuba's government, and they completely ignore this history. That there was plenty of revolutionaries that had basically fought for a free and democratic Cuba that were not communists, that Castro had basically backstabbed and had them killed. You had this one guy called Huber Matos. He was a commander during the Cuban Revolution. He fought on the same side as Castro against Batista. He fought for a free and independent Cuba. Now, what happened is, right after the Cuban Revolution, he complained to Castro and told Castro that the government is being infiltrated by communists. Communists are taking over our government, and they're going to make our revolution pointless. Everything that we fought for freedom, for Cuba's independence from Batista. And Castro basically told him, oh, don't worry about it. But that ended up happening is communists took over the government. Castro declared himself a socialist. And then Matos resigned. He basically resigned from his post, said, I cannot do this. Castro had him arrested, declared an enemy of the people. He actually... Castro yelled at crowds of people, and the crowd of people was actually yelling that Matos should be shot. So Castro had entire violent mobs of people that were basically threatening this guy. And he sentenced this guy 20 years in prison. This guy was a commander in the during the Cuban Revolution. He fought on the same side as Castro for a free and independent Cuba, and Castro backstabbed this guy, put this guy 20 years in prison. Absolutely disgusting. But there's actually much worse stories than this. And one of the worst, most depressing stories of the Cuban Revolution is you have the story of William Alexander Morgan. William Alexander Morgan, he was an American that was a revolutionary. He fought in the on the same side as Castro against Batista. And there's actually even a picture of him actually walking through Havana with Castro. So about William Alexander Morgan, he was an American that when the Cuban Revolution happened, he traveled to Cuba. And he thought that the Cuban Revolution was very similar to the American Revolution. The ideals of fighting for democracy against this authoritarian figure that was ruining the lives of Cubans. So he came to Cuba. He fought in the revolution, fought for Cuba's freedom. He was actually part of the Second National Front of the Escambray, that other rebel group. And what ended up happening is after the Cuban Revolution, he was interviewed about the growing communist threat in Cuba. And he said specifically that Castro is a good friend of mine. He's not a communist. He wouldn't do something like this. And that, Cubans are not going to accept communism. There's even a video of him. Take a look at this, of what he says. So Morgan believed Castro. He thought that Castro was going to create a democracy in Cuba and make it, a great nation. That it was going to be a free and prosperous nation, away from the corruption of Batista. But what happened is that didn't happen. And Morgan ended up actually smuggling in weapons to actually help that exact same group that he was part of, the Second National Front of the Escambray, so that they could help overthrow Castro and establish a democratic state in Cuba. Castro had him arrested and executed. And the horrible thing of it, he put his wife in prison for 10 years. His wife was released after 10 years, and then she ended up moving to America. She moved to Florida. And the messed up thing about Morgan is that Castro would not even release his body. So for decades, Castro was such a scumbag that he kept Morgan's body for decades and would not release his body. And this guy deserves a movie. He honestly deserves a movie made about him. This guy is probably a guy you've never heard of until I'm talking about him here. This guy was a hero of the Cuban Revolution. He fought for freedom and democracy in Cuba, and he was completely backstabbed by Castro. And you also had the Escambray Rebellion. The Escambray Rebellion basically lasted for 6 years. A lot of these guys were members of the Second National Front of the Escambray. These guys were revolutionaries. Again, they fought on the same side as Castro for free and independent Cuba. Castro had backstabbed these people, and these people were pissed about Castro establishing this communist dictatorship in Cuba, and they had fought again for Cuba's freedom and independence, but it failed. It didn't work out in the end. And the vast majority of people, they were arrested and killed. So that failed. It was a rebellion that lasted for 6 years with thousands of members, but it didn't last. Now, moving on, how many people did Castro kill? Castro had imprisoned thousands of people during his reign. I tried to find an exact number of how many people Castro killed. Castro killed somewhere between 10 to 20,000 people. Some people believe it's even more than 20,000 people. But the thing about this, and what personally pisses me off, is that I see these idiots, these complete dumbasses, excuse my language, who don't even know what communism is. Like, people even in my country, in America, they grew up in, privileges, everything that they have in America. People, a lot of the stuff that people have in America, Cubans would wish that they had this stuff. Cubans wish they had lives like Americans. And I see idiots, in my country that basically praise Cuba's system, say, Cuba's a great system, communism works in Cuba, everybody has free housing, everybody has, great healthcare, blah, blah, blah. They know nothing about Cuba. And if these idiots, honestly, these stupid communists, if they think that Cuba is such a great place to live, then why don't they go live there? That's what I always say. They complain about, capitalism so much in America. You can go to Cuba. It's not that far from America. You can board a plane, go to Cuba. Go to Cuba, say that you're a communist, seek asylum there. But no, they're going to be sitting on their iPhones, and they're going to be basically complaining about capitalism, and they're going to be talking about how great of a country Cuba is, when they know absolutely nothing about it, and they don't know anything about the oppression and what people went through. So basically, to sum it up here, the Cuban Revolution was justified. People were right to overthrow Batista. Batista was a piece of shit. He was a scumbag. He deserved to get overthrown. Not everybody that fought in the Cuban Revolution was a communist. There was plenty of people that wanted a free and democratic state. Castro ended up taking over. He created a communist dictatorship, and then he had anybody killed and arrested that basically went against him. And now going as to the Operation 40. What was Operation 40 exactly? Operation 40 was a CIA group. It was a CIA group made up of CIA agents and also Cuban exiles. And the total number of people in the group was 40. That's why it was called Operation 40. And that's what the name of the mission is in Black Ops 1. Now, a lot of the people involved in Operation 40 were actually scumbags. So you had like really evil CIA agents that were involved in that. And some of these guys that were involved in Operation 40 were people that worked for Batista. So Batista's dictatorship, there's Cuban military officers that had worked for his dictatorship that were part of Operation 40. And what ended up, Operation 40 had played a role in the Bay of Pigs invasion, but Operation 40 was not the bulk of the force in the Bay of Pigs. I'll talk about the Bay of Pigs in a moment here. What ended up happening to Operation 40 is it lasted until the early 1970s. They had a plane crashed in Southern California with an Operation 40 member, and the plane was actually full of cocaine. So they were literally, there was Operation 40 members that were trafficking cocaine to fund their operations. And then an Operation 40 member actually died in a shootout with Miami police and had tons of cocaine on him. So Operation 40 was also involved in the drug trade. So a lot of people that were involved in Operation 40 were drug traffickers, and they were scumbags. Now, the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs is actually something else. While Operation 40 played a role in it, the Bay of Pigs is basically what's going on at this time here in Black Ops 1. The Bay of Pigs is a location in Cuba. It's on the southern coast of Cuba. And the CIA thought that it was a good idea to launch an invasion there. They did not think that it would be as guarded. The area where the Bay of Pigs is actually a very swampy area, which actually makes any kind of invasion, amphibious landing, actually very difficult, which is one of the reasons that the Bay of Pigs soldiers actually got trapped in the swamp. They got trapped and they got surrounded. They didn't really have anywhere to go. The Bay of Pigs invasion was basically an invasion made up of 1,500 Cuban exiles. The CIA had basically armed and trained them and had basically deployed them in southern Cuba. And the whole idea of the Bay of Pigs was that the Bay of Pigs invasion was going to happen. They were going to launch a rebellion, and the people in Cuba were supposed to basically rise up against Castro alongside the invasion force of 1,500. And the army was supposed to grow larger and larger as they were supposed to get volunteers, and they were supposed to eventually march Havana. It never even got close to Havana. It was a disaster. It failed. One of the reasons that the Bay of Pigs invasion had actually failed was because Castro was a pretty popular leader at this time. This happened in 1961, so 1961, Castro was a popular leader at this time. It's very different in decades later, where Cubans really started to hate him. The reason that Castro became so popular is because, like I said, he led a revolution against the oppressive dictatorship of Batista. He became very popular. Through that, people saw him as a freedom fighter, and they wanted to support him. And a lot of Cubans, they did not know what communism was. And you can't really blame them at the same time for going along with Castro, because there was massive corruption in Cuba, massive poverty when Batista was the dictator, and, huge amounts of Cubans did not know how to read and write. And when Castro basically promised literacy programs, he promised, I'm going to teach, everybody how to read and write. We're going to have free healthcare. We're going to have free housing. People are going to have free food. When basically Castro made all of these promises, people, a lot of Cubans were looking at that and be like, maybe communism is a good idea after all. And what Castro did was basically, he said, the evil Americans, they were supporting Batista, which again, to a degree is true. But he basically used that as propaganda to solidify his rule and basically try to get Cubans to unite against the Americans. So that's basically one of the reasons that the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, is because early on, a lot of Cubans did not know how bad communism would be. They thought that it sounded good on paper, but they didn't realize what would end up happening later on. The second reason the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, because like I said, it was in a swampy area. It was not a good place to make any kind of landing. The Cuban army responded very quickly to that, and they surrounded them. And Kennedy was the one who authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, Kennedy he did not send the American Air Force in to back up the Bay of Pigs rebels. The reason that Kennedy did not actually send in the Air Force because he wanted plausible deniability. He basically wanted to say, oh, we're not involved in it, and he did not want to make the U.S. look like it was imperialist. And he thought that by not that if he got involved, that it would aggravate the Soviets, who were allies of Cuba. That's basically what Kennedy believed. Now, looking back on this was probably a really, really bad decision. If Kennedy had sent the American Air Force in and they had actually hit the Cuban military, the Bay of Pigs soldiers might have actually gotten a lot farther into Cuba. We don't know what would have happened, but a lot of people say that was a mistake, that Kennedy did not send the American Air Force in to back up the Bay of Pigs soldiers. Now, the thing is, this completely backfired on Kennedy, because Kennedy thought that the Soviets would be, that the Soviets would get really angry and they would get really aggressive if the U.S. had used their Air Force in the Bay of Pigs invasion. But the opposite happened. The Soviets got really aggressive regardless, because they saw the Americans as weak. They basically said, the Americans failed in the Bay of Pigs, and it emboldened the Soviets in that exact same year in the Berlin crisis. The Berlin crisis was basically where East-West Berlin was. Nikita Khrushchev, who was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union at this time, what he did was he basically he did the same thing that Stalin did, where he demanded that all American forces leave West Berlin and give it to East Germany. That's what it was. Because West Berlin was a capitalist, democratic system that was in a communist country, East Germany. And the U.S. refused. And when the U.S. refused, what Khrushchev did was he sent a bunch of tanks over to the checkpoint where East and West Berlin met. This is before the Berlin Wall actually was built. One of the reasons that Khrushchev was so angry is because so many East Berliners were actually going to West Berlin for a better life. And so it was a massive brain drain on East Berlin, and East Berlin lost a lot of talented individuals, but it was their fault because they had a crappy, terrible system. So what ended up happening is a lot of East Berliners went to West Berlin. Khrushchev got pissed, demanded West Berlin back, and the Soviet tanks and American tanks were in a standoff. And eventually, Khrushchev and Kennedy talked to each other, and what happened was the tanks agreed to back off. One Soviet tank would back up slowly until it was gone, then an American tank would back up. And that's basically how it de-escalated. And later on, the Soviets helped build the Berlin Wall, which basically separated East and West Berlin, and then the rest of the story of the Berlin Wall. Now, about the Bay of Pigs invasion, the CIA, and this is why I say this, the CIA are such scumbags. They are honestly such scumbags. They put in these 1,500 Cuban exiles, and they basically just abandoned them there. They just left them there. They betrayed them. They screwed them over. Brigade 2506, that was the name of the unit that was in the Bay of Pigs. The CIA backstabbed those soldiers. They just left them there to rot. Those soldiers got captured, surrounded, and they got tortured in prison. A lot of them got executed. And what ended up happening is the U.S. eventually made a deal with Cuba, where they basically paid Cuba, I think, like $50 million and like food and medical aid in exchange for releasing the exiles that had fought in the Bay of Pigs invasion. So the Bay of Pigs was an ultimate disaster. And what the Cuban government did was they basically said, the Bay of Pigs invaders were made up of mostly Batista soldiers, but that's not entirely true. Maybe there were some Batista, former Batista soldiers that were with the Bay of Pigs invaders, sure, but there's plenty of exiles that had actually fought in the 26th of July movement against Batista, and they didn't like the communist takeover that their country was going through. The leader of Brigade 2506, Manuel Artime, was actually a former revolutionary in the same faction as Castro. That was the leader of the Bay of Pigs invaders. He was a very religious man. He was a very religious. He was Catholic. And when Castro came to power, oh man, he really went after the Catholic Church. He treated the Catholic Church like garbage. Catholics were heavily discriminated. Catholics are even discriminated even to this day in Cuba. But Catholics today have greater rights than they did decades ago. But decades ago, it was really, really bad. Basically, that sums up, Cuba's history. It was a disaster. The U.S. made a really bad choice by supporting Batista. It was a really bad choice, and then Castro basically used that as propaganda to solidify his reign. Castro was a complete scumbag. He was a bastard. He destroyed Cuba. absolutely destroyed it, ruined it. And you have these idiots who defend Castro. They think that Castro is some kind of freedom fighter to this day. They think that Castro is a good man who freed Cuba from, evil American capitalism and evil American imperialism. That's the way they look at it. I'm not defending Batista. Batista was a scumbag. He deserved to get overthrown. But what Cuba does to this day is that if you criticize the Cuban government whatsoever, and they will basically say, oh, you supported Batista. And if you are like a Cuban American and your family came from Cuba, if you criticize the Cuban government says, oh, they were all rich landowners who like fled Cuba. They were greedy capitalists. When no, a lot of poor people had fled Cuba. These were not rich landowners to live in Florida. And Cuban Americans are some of the most patriotic people ever. They absolutely love America. They love what America stands for. But it was a mistake that the U.S. had supported Batista. And unfortunately, Cuba to this day is still under pretty much a communist dictatorship. Things have gotten more calm. There have been some free market reforms put in, but Cuba is still under is still pretty much a dictatorship. And as for the embargo on Cuba, America's had an embargo on Cuba for over 60 years. And I know people in the comments are going to ask me, Professional, what do you think of the embargo? Do you think the U.S. should keep embargoing Cuba? My opinion on that is when I was younger, I believed that the U.S. should keep the embargo. But now what I basically think about it is I think the embargo should be lifted on Cuba. And the reason that I think the embargo should be lifted is because the embargo ultimately helps the Cuban dictatorship. It does. The Cuban dictatorship spreads around a lot of propaganda. Like, for example, they say that the embargo it embargoes food and medicine, but that's not true. The embargo actually does not affect food and medicine. That's actually something that communists have actually spread around as propaganda for some time. What I mean when I say the embargo helps the dictatorship in Cuba is because whenever there's any kind of problems in Cuba, when there's food shortages, when there's electrical problems, when there's medical shortages, the Cuban government says, oh, the reason you're poor, the reason you don't have medicine, the reason you don't have food, the reason there's long lines at the grocery store in Cuba, it's not because of communism, it's because of America, it's because of, the American embargo. That's why I don't support sanctions. That's why I don't support embargoes. Because all sanctions and embargoes do is they help dictators. They help solidify the power of the dictator. Because what the dictator will do is he will blame all of the problems on America. And will basically say, oh, all the problems in Cuba or Venezuela or North Korea, wherever else, whatever other country that you can think of, they will basically say that all these problems are because of the Americans. It is not because of communism. It's not because of socialism. It is because of the Americans. And it will keep them in power. Think about that. Any kind of dictatorship that has ever been sanctioned by America. Have sanctions ever worked? Really? No, they haven't. So all it does is basically gives dictators powers. And like, for example, if I was president, I would remove the embargo from Cuba. I would remove all sanctions from Cuba. And what I would do is I would then say, look, I have removed all the sanctions and I've removed the embargo from Cuba. And guess what? Cuba is still poor. Cuba is still a failed state. And the government of Cuba at that point could not use that as propaganda. And people in Cuba will basically say, wait, you told us it was the embargo was the reason we were poor, but the embargo's been lifted. Why are we still poor? Why is our country still a disaster? And people would start questioning the government more. So I think that, honestly, lifting the embargo would be a good thing because the Cuban government could not use that as propaganda. They constantly use that as propaganda. And you have so many communists in my country, you have so many idiots that what they do is they basically say, oh, all the problems in Cuba are because of the American embargo, when that's not entirely true. One of the big problems that Cuba has a massive failing electrical grid. Like, their electrical grid has been failing. Cuba has been going through massive blackouts. And Cuba has nationalized everything. They don't allow any private property. They don't allow any private corporations. So if there was a private corporation that actually provided electricity, they would have done it way better than what the government is doing. So to the idiots that constantly say, oh, Cuba's problems are because of the American embargo, how does Cuba's electrical system, their turbines, how does Cuba's electrical turbines failing have anything to do with the American embargo? It's your electrical systems. It's your turbines that are failing. What does that have to do with the American embargo? That is basically it. So you see what the Cuban government does? They use this as propaganda constantly against the U.S., and that's what I will say about it, is that the embargo should be lifted, and then they can no longer use this as propaganda, because it's been ridiculous. Cuba has suffered long enough, and this regime needs to go. That's basically what I say. I don't support American interventionism in Cuba, so I don't support like the U.S. invading Cuba or anything like that. I hope that Cuba one day on its own is like free and gets rid of communism once and for all in Cuba, because it's a disaster every single place it's been implemented. It's been a disaster. But and I think that anybody that's Cuban American, if you're watching my video, you know, please tell me in the comments what you think of what I said about Cuba's history, if you agree with what I said. But that's basically it. I know I've been talking a lot on this, but I like to, you know, talk a lot of history when I go through a lot of this stuff. But enough of that. Let's go to the let's play Black Ops here. We're gonna resume basically the campaign and going through this here.
Any minute. There's a signal. Now! Hook up. This is it.
¡Te escucho! Aguanten en la posición hasta que llegue el refuerzo. Repito.
I know that when he said escucho, that means listen.
La invasión empezó. La pista de aterrizaje está bajo ataque. Tenemos hombres en camino. Aguanten en la posición hasta que llegue el refuerzo. Repito. ¡Lo agarré! ¡Registrado!
Perfect. You're all focused on the airfield.
¡Lo miro!
Convoy ahead. Do not engage. Sit tight. Let him pass. Bowman, left flank. Move out!
¡Están los tiempos! ¡Afirmativo! ¡Ahí están! ¡Lo agarré! ¡Buen ojo! ¡Ahí está! ¡Buen ojo! ¡Registrado! ¡Está en lo cierto! ¡Te escucho! ¡Afirmativo! ¡Mierda!
Move quickly! This way, up the stairs. Got it. Castro's paranoid. With good reason. We've been trying to get him for 3 years. But today's the day we succeed.
¡Registrado! ¡Confirmado!
Stay close.
¡Lo miro! ¡Te oigo! ¡Te escucho! ¡Enfermero aquí! ¡Buen ojo!
He's down!
¡Lo agarré! ¡Ahí está! ¡Confirmado! ¡Registrado!
He's dead!
¡Ahí están!
Reloading, cover me!
¡Hombre abajo! ¡Está en lo cierto!
Oh, an RPK. Nice. Okay.
¡Lo miro! ¡Buen ojo!
Target eliminated.
¡Mierda! ¡Hombre dañado!
Hostile down.
Target down! Inside, go!
¡Confirmado!
Bowman, take the roof. Any trouble, give us a yell. Got it. Mason, on me. We search room to room till we find Castro.
¡Médico! ¡Confirmado! ¡Ahí!
Confirmed.
¡Confirmed! ¡Enfermero aquí!
Tango down.
Tango down!
That's confirmed!
He's down.
¡Hay un enfermero aquí! ¡Buen ojo! ¡Afirmativo!
Damn. Okay. Did I get him? I think I did. Okay.
What the fuck? Bowman, what's happening?
The P-26s, they're dropping all over the place.
Sit tight, we'll be done in 5. Target should be up ahead. Roger.
Target down.
¡Bien pegado!
Get to cover!
¡Hombre herido!
Okay, stack up. What are you waiting for? Come on! Let's do it.
¡Confirmado!
Bowman, nest is empty. We're moving on.
Better make it fast. B-26s are about to begin their bombing run.
Target should be up ahead. Roger. Movement inside. Get in position. This is it. Ready to make history? Crazy bitch. He uses the human shield, and she still protects him?
Castro supporters are fanatical in their devotion to him.
Bowman, the target is down.
That is true. Castro had a pretty big cult of personality around him. And here's a little thing. There's a little Easter egg that you notice on Castro. If you actually look at his body, it's still red. So it's like he's still alive. That's a little hint right there.
Let's get the fuck out of here! Move! They're taking fire! Move up. And
Roger that.
About Castro is the most, like, out of all the leaders in human history, Castro is the leader that has had the most amount of assassination attempts on him.
Keep your head down,
If you want to know how many assassination attempts Castro has had on him, it's 600. Over 600 assassination attempts. And he survived. He is probably the luckiest leader in human history. It's unfortunate that one of those did not succeed, because it would have saved so many people's lives.
Keep moving! Target down!
Confirmed. Hostile down.
Hit me by the barrel! Leave the barrel! He's dead! God damn! Get the fuck out of here for those damn planes blow to pieces!
Tango down.
Also, about the planes, the Cuban exiles during the Bay of Pigs invasion had some air support, but it was very limited.
This ain't good. There's too many of them. Take out that 50 cal. Carlos's men should be here.
Carlos, what's happening? Carlos!
Here they come, over the east wall.
You think I let you down, Juan? My men will cover your escape.
BTR!
Okay, damn,
Now, hurry, my friend!
God bless
okay,
you,
they blew it
Carlos.
up.
This way, into the sugar fields.
Oh, and speaking of which, there's one thing I forgot. And this basically shows you how much of a disaster Cuba's economy is. So for all the idiots that basically think that Cuba is such an economically success story, they think that communism in Cuba works so well. Guess what? One of the reasons that Cuba was actually able to survive for so long under a communist government is because the Soviet Union funded them. That is the primary reason. Do you know that when the Soviet Union bought sugar from Cuba, it paid 11 times the price of sugar? 11 times. Who pays 11 times the price of anything? The only reason the Soviets were paying 11 times the price of sugar, of Cuban sugar, is so to keep Cuba afloat. That was the primary reason. In the 80s, the Soviets started paying Cuba 3 times the price of sugar. And then what ended up happening is after the Soviet Union collapsed, the money stopped coming in. And then Cuba became even more of a disaster. And it's the same thing with North Korea. Like, a lot of people say that North Korea's living standards were better than South Korea's living standards for some time. And to a degree, that is true. The 50s, 60s, and 70s, North Korea did have higher living standards than South Korea. But that was because both China and the Soviet Union were funding North Korea. It was two superpowers that were funding North Korea. And then what happened is, after the Cold War, the funding stopped. And then North Korea went through a massive famine in the 1990s. So this is the people that always say Cuba is such a success story. Communism works in Cuba. No, it doesn't. What country pays 11 times more for the price of sugar? The only reason they did that was to keep Cuba, the Cuban economy alive.
Rebels are getting getting their asses kicked.
Better get down there. Hook up. Go!
Boys, it's all falling apart. You need to get out of here.
You secure our transport?
The plane is ready, so we'll be torn to pieces on takeoff.
One problem at a time, brother.
We're leaving! Move it!
So yeah, these are the Bay of Pigs soldiers here.
We can't wait any longer.
These guys are all gonna get captured or killed.
Hurry!
Give us cover, mate!
And let me actually check that my music is on. I might have the oh, music volume is on. Okay. I just wanted to check that to make sure it was.
Listen!
We're getting hit!
Mason, take out those APUs!
Mason, protect the plane!
What? We got a problem! The fucking vehicles are blocking the runway!
I hear you, Bowman.
There's not enough time for takeoff!
I'll deal with it.
Mason! Please, Craig, capture you up out there! Mason, what are you doing? Mason!
Runway's clear.
Damn you, Mason!
No choice, Woods. I knew what I signed up for. Got me fine. Just go. Get out of here.
You're dead. We killed you.
No. You killed a double. You think we didn't know of your plan?
We always know.
Do with him what you wish, General. He's my gift to you, in honor of our new relationship. Just make sure that he suffers.
He will know suffering beyond his darkest fears. I have plans for you, American.
Oh, he did. Dragovich sure did.
Okay, guys, so I guess we will wrap this up here. I hope that you guys enjoyed my, history discussion there. Hope you guys don't get too bored by it. But as I go through a lot of the missions, especially when I go through the Vietnam missions and the Soviet Siberian missions, I'll actually talk a lot about history and also the Vorkuta. When I get to the Vorkuta chapter, that's the next part. I'll actually talk a lot about Vorkuta because it was a real place. But thank you guys for watching. I hope that you guys enjoyed this part. If you did, drop a like, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day, guys.